Okay, hi everyone. My name is Desmond. Before I begin, just to make a few qualifiers. First of all, I don't come from the art history perspective or the cultural studies or media studies perspective, so I ask you to bear with me. My background is anthropology, sociology, so I'm working a lot with space and context. So hence I will not have a script to read from, so I'm sorry about that. A lot of what I do is still emerging, is developing. So what I'm going to do is basically I'm going to maybe, let's say, provoke you, as a kind of a provocation with images, text, and so I'm looking at the text here as performative, and as we move along, hopefully you get a sense of where I'm coming from. I'm not an expert of the picturesque. I'm trying to work with different ways of seeing, many different gazes, and I'm hoping to see how we can understand this idea of picturesque in a contemporary way. I'm also with the Cologne Business School, so I've kind of opted to join the dark side. So I'm not really there because my background is anthropology, sociology, but I'm not really in the university either, so I'm in a liminal space. So once again, please forgive me. So I'm just going to begin just to tell you a bit of, this is basically where I'm coming from, just to give you some idea. I teach and I research the idea of mobilities, and I work with tourism spaces, destinations. And what's most important for me about this is basically the last line. I work with complex combinations, and this is going back to Shell and Uri's definition of tourism mobilities. What are complex combinations of movement and stillness, realities, fantasies, play and work? And I think these ideas have been developed during this conference, especially when we talk about the picturesque. This morning or this earlier before this, Stephen Jacobs was actually talking about this idea of movement and stillness in the picturesque. So I think there's a lot of resonance in where we're going with. So instead of picturesque, could we look at this in terms of what is a fantasy? What is imagination? So a lot of how we're developing will be about that. I'm interested in the constitution of space, but also how these spaces lead to ideas of belonging identities. How these spaces are performed and how meanings are attributed to this kind of space. So in short, it's always embodied, always becoming, and this is of course going towards a more geographical perspective. How do we actually look at spaces as cultural? And how are these cultural spaces kind of reproduced in a bigger picture? How do we actually try to understand these spaces? So before I go into the spaces itself, I'll try to give a broad picture. This is just a poster which I just presented some month ago at a UNESCO conference in Leuven in Belgium. And this is just an idea of the bigger framework of which I'm working with. I'm working with, this is a bit hard to see. So this idea of museum of the tourist. So whether I'm working with how spaces can be museumized, and so I'm interested in tourist culture, not cultural tourism. And going back to the previous presentation on Chernobyl, I think it's a very important topic. There is also leading from that kind of dark tourism, Chernobyl tourism, and this is quite sad sometimes for me to see when I do that kind of research. But I'm actually working with the tourist culture. So in a way, how tourists actually perform in spaces and how are these spaces recaptured as an artifact? Can we actually look at it that way? And if so, how do we then museumize this space and look at the artifact? But the question for me here is going back to that diagram in the middle. Who is looking and what is this space? So I'm actually moving towards this idea of Europe. So the bigger picture is I'm interested in European integration and how do we understand Europe, but not from within Europe. How do we understand Europe from without? So this is the big picture. How do we look from outside eyes? What is this gaze that constitutes Europe? And so this is the big picture. Okay, so coming to the specific picture is this picture. So before we go on, and I hope none of you read the abstract, how many of you just in this room have seen this picture before? One, you know this picture. Okay, most of you have not seen this picture. Good. So most of you, I would assume in this room, don't know this picture, right? I showed this picture to a group of, where do you come from?
From Potsdam.
Potsdam. Oh, okay, so not too far, but still. So you have special knowledge. I showed this picture to a group of students here. There were 8 German students. There were 6 students, Erasmus students from all over Europe, and I had 3 Chinese students. Nobody knew where it was except for the 3 Chinese students. I was shocked. And so that very experience I had in class where the 3 Chinese students said, of course, this is Hallstatt, Austria. I mean, everybody knows this. And I was shocked. I was like, what? And so that from one small thing like this, it started me looking at this image here as what's so fantastic about this. You couldn't call it the picturesque. Yeah, maybe you could, but let's get back to that at the end, okay? Question is, what makes this image so special? Yeah, and so I went to the sites, I went to check a few places, and then it said here on the website of Hallstatt, World Heritage Site, millionfold photographed, copied once, never reached. What does this mean? What is this copied once? What was copied about this? And what does it mean to be photographed 1 million times? So the story develops in a very interesting way. So when I start checking this up, I look at the most photographed places in the world. No surprise, this is actually Europe. Europe is the most photographed place in the continent, agglomeration of places. This is no surprise. The most number of tourists actually come from all around the world to Europe. No surprise. Europeans are also the ones who are most traveled going out of the world. No surprise. So when you look at this, how does it really work? So now if you have your phones with you, and if you Google most photographed place, Europe, right now, you can try if you want. I want to see if you actually see this image. How many of you actually see this image when you Google most photographed place? Hopefully in English, you can try in your own languages as well. Would you see the image within the first 10 images? Would you see this? How many of you actually see this picture within the first 10 images? No. You do? Okay. You do. So you see this as one of the most photographed places in the world, okay, in Austria. All right. So this is Hallstatt, Austria, and if you look at it, this is a site. And what I want to work on is this intermediality of what is the most photographed village in Europe. And of course, this title is going to change as we move along. When I start developing this a bit, what does it mean to be, well, one of the most photographed villages in Europe? When you look at the tourism development here, you look at this is overnighters. You can see there are 140,000 overnighters in 2018. Not so, I mean, I am only showing you this in order to refer to the next slide here. There are 780 local residents and 1 million visitors. So a lot of people have talked about in terms of over-tourism, old news. Not surprising as well. What's interesting is you have 1 million visitors and you have 140,000 overnighters. It's quite a big difference. And the reason being is a lot of these people, they come for only one purpose, is to get the image of what we've just seen. And some of them would just come off the bus there, stand under those trees, right, and they would take that image. But that's not really possible because the image has to be from the other side. So it means that the tourists would have to walk along that beautiful path to the other side of the village, capture that image and come back. So it would be an optimum time of, if you walk leisurely, about 1 hour. The parking for these buses are also 1 hour. So it means that you see a lot of mobilities here to try to establish what this image is. But some of the key development that makes this so impressive, and this is going back to various ways of gazing at this site, these 3 events, let's call it. The first is the idea of when it was given World Heritage status. And what's interesting about this World Heritage status is, like I say, there's one thing to do it, but we're looking at the gaze here. And if you Google, again, let's say, World Heritage View, you would get, again, Hallstatt. If you Google it in German, Welterbeblick, okay, you would also get Hallstatt. So Hallstatt really capitalized on this idea of, in a way, the Hallstattian version of the picturesque in order to capture this shot. Now, of course, for me, from my tourist perspective, what would be interesting is to see what the tourists do. Do they actually go beyond that framing device? Yeah. Maybe that metonymy, yeah, or do they stand with the backdrop of World Heritage View? And most of the tourists actually take it the picture with the framing device, right? And that which makes me very, goes back to, I'm thinking of Marguerite when I did this, what is this in peep? The kinds of representations that are involved in this. What do you really want in the embodiment of the image? Yeah, what are you really seeing when something like this comes to be? Yeah, the second event here, which is interesting, is a soap opera called The Spring Waltz. This is a Korean soap, and there's a film, there's a part, I'll show you a bit of it, that is filmed in Hallstatt. Now what's interesting about this is not so much the content of the film, but also probably some of you might know it, the Hallyu, or the Korean wave. All of you probably know Gangnam Style. Gangnam Style was one of the first penetrations of the Korean wave, Hallyu, into the European scene. Since then, it was on the top of the charts, viral on YouTube for, I think, 2 years, until now, of course, Despacito has taken over, and you all know this as well. So, but Gangnam Style was the thing. And along with all these kind of soap operas that have kind of transfused the whole of the scope of Asia. Now, what's interesting about this is you can see, the very kind of Western orientation of what's here, grand piano, kind of a cultured ethos, and how we actually, it's almost a kind of dispossession of this space. I'm just going to play a bit of this to show you how Hallstatt is being represented in this film. Sorry about that. I know some of you are already lost in the dreamscape. So as you can see, it's so romantic, even with the swan in backdrop. Notice it's also taken a time of day where all the tourists are not around. Oops. Yeah. So this is the usual format. Again, love scenes between the four people. There are always four protagonists, two males, two females, and there's always some kind of balance. The trick in these kinds of soaps are basically what the combination is. Pretty straightforward. The last one, which is most important, the one that I'm really getting to, is this idea of the replica. And this really answers the statement of this idea of the copy or the mimesis of what this scenescape actually represents. And let me show you what this is. So this is basically that same replica. This same replica was reproduced in Huizhou in China. Someone actually got hold of the papers of the architectural the plan, the draft plan, and this was actually transported directly, building for building, brick by brick. Oh, at least the architecture is to China. So what I want to show you is, we're working with the discourse of how this Chinese replica of Hallstatt is so popular in China that visitors are flocking to it. Now, after I show you this film, we'll try to compare what really is happening in this cave. But let me show you this one first.
There are many Chinese Austria, and they want to be in it too. For some reason, the small village in the Salzkammer region is immensely popular.
Performativity here, how these spaces are being engaged here, and hence giving rise to this idea of millionfold photographed, copied once, never reached. So what we have now is we see two distinct spaces, and these spaces work with each other to reproduce this idea of tourism. And what I'm unsure about is going back to the idea of what's been talked about, what's indexical. I'm trying to understand the reproduction of what, almost a kind of a hyperreal concept. How do we understand the notions of space according to authenticity, and how do we develop this concept a bit further? I'm working with a few ideas. One is Jansson's idea of texture, putting space through texture. How do we texturize various kinds of space, and actually how do different peoples understand these kinds of spaces? Streitreinders also talks about a kind of tourism. Now, he talks about media tourism. I'm more interested in the mediation of tourism. But how does this power and popularity of the symbols? What are the symbols? And as you can see in Hallstatt, a lot of symbolic content here. What is it that constitutes that imagination and reality? Because the imagination has already begun in China, right? Or has the imagination of China already begun in Austria, or is it in Europe? So it questions a lot of this contextual definitive of what space are. In a more tourism context, Noel Salazar has talked about imaginaries as a kind of representational assemblage that interact with personal imaginings, and how do meanings actually derive out of world-shaping devices. And so he says that, wait a minute, hang on, your tourists are made to imagine themselves in a kind of vanished Eden, or maybe a post-Eden, where the local landscape and population are consumed through observation, embodied sensation, and imagination. So instead of talking about the picturesque, a lot of tourism literature goes back to the imagination. And if anything, tourism is part of the image production industry, in which identities of destinations are being reinvented, reproduced, recaptured, and recreated. And what we see here is a post-consumption process of co-consumption, basically where the tourists also produce the itinerary of the touristscape and also the actual consumption of self. So it just feeds on itself. So the basis of this paper is basically looking at how do we actually understand spaces related to leisure and tourism, what actually happens here, what else is being consumed, how are these represented, manifested, and practiced through mediation, and how are these ideas of intermediation and this presentation being a part of it affect the ways in which we understand the picturesque, or maybe not understand the picturesque. So if you study the place itself, and these pictures are taken by me now, how this performance also adds to, again, other kinds of symbols that tell or communicate with the tourists on how to behave in a proper way. And not only how to behave, but what to watch out for. And again, you go back to this stereotypes of who's flying drones and all that, and this is called a no-drone zone. Obviously, there are a lot of drones flying about, creating a different kind of visibility around the site. And then, of course, there are also pickpockets around. Be careful with that. A lot of signage. So how do these signage add to that original picturesque scape of Hallstatt? You also have things like this, again, the performative value of the so-called didundo, dressed by a Chinese woman with that backdrop. And other more interesting ones. This is the most interesting question I got. I talked to some of the tour guides there, and they said this was something that I picked up. A lot of the Chinese asked, where are the actors living? And that really struck me. This was another blow to my own research, like where are the actors living? And I was like, oh my God. So for them, this was a living museum. This was a museumized space where actors were circulating freely. Austrian paid actors were circulated freely around the tourists and entertaining them in a certain way. No surprise, because the tourists walk into the houses of the Austrians, hence the signs. This creates a lot of stuff, a lot of resentment, and this was depicted in a film called Double Happiness by Ella Rido. Now, what's interesting about this film, it's a double representation, complexifying the issue even more, because this film is very surreal. It looks at this dichotomy between these spaces, but it also recaptures the Austrian landscape in a kind of miniaturized scape, right? How do we actually see what is being represented, and how do we provoke ideas of authenticity and the kind of a zoomed out perspective of a picturesque? So this confuses things a bit more, and so I don't have time to show you a bit of this, but the idea is quite thought-provoking how this really comes to bear. I'm going to just mention two authors whom I usually, when I talk about in papers in the last 15 years, I talk about these two authors, Meccano and John Orry, and I usually go beyond these authors. And the reason why I'm presenting here is because more and more of research I do, I realize that I'm coming back to these people in terms of what's visual. It's not that a lot of the complaints about this is that it's a lot of very semiotic and there's not enough embodiment. But I'm finding myself coming back to understand what authenticity is, and how stage authenticity has to go beyond what is real versus the non-real, what is front stage versus the backstage, and how it's the desire to look into the backstage life of others is a lot more complex. It's not about the authentic experience, it's a lot more than, it's something else that we are embedded with. The other one is John Orry's tourist gaze, and how do you actually understand this regulation of the gaze? How do you actually work with culture so that when a place is when something is considered out of place, it is regulated through a cultural difference. And so this semiotic gaze is coming back to me now as I work on the picturesque. How do we understand, go back to John Orry's gaze that we have been kind of moving beyond for so long. And so when I come back to the picturesque, I go back to, let's say, everyone, Gilpin has been talked about a lot today, so I'm not going to mention him. But the kind of beauty which is agreeable in a picture, right? There's a kind of pleasure encapsulated into what it means to be a painting. And what Stephen Jacobs mentioned this morning about the Claude glass, huh? What's Claudian? And this tranche de terre, what is a slice of the landscape of the earth? Yeah. How do we actually understand that slice of the scape? And when I look at this beautiful picturesque that he talks about, I'm now re-wondering if we actually can go back to this old definition of what picturesque is. Of course, my problem here is for whom? And this is the kinds of the idea of the spectator. How do we actually understand this from the spectator? Of course, this is a provocative question. We know for whom this was written for, but I'm trying to understand this in a discursive framework. How do we actually look at it from a distance, the for whom into the by whom? Yeah. Again, going back to the regulation, if it's created by the observer on a picturesque travel, what is this by whom, and how do we understand different cultural conglomerates in this meaning-making process? We, the picturesque people, are a little misunderstood. Who are the we? Yeah. And so when we go back to ideas of Orientalism, I mean, you know this, I'm going to, but how spaces are created out of various kinds of discourses, mostly powered. It lends to one quote here, and not really a quote, just an idea that Western culture has produced a view of the Orient based on a particular imagination. All of you, I mean, this is standard stuff, old stuff. But my question is not so much what the Orient is. My question is, what is Western culture? And so this for whom thing is really bugging me now. And I go to another piece of literature written by Joy Hendry, and she talks about the Orient striking back. And she works with theme parks in Japan and saying, wait a minute, hang on, is there a re-understanding of this cultural space across culture? So, the Japanese representation of, say, a European theme park in Japan, is that an Orient strikes back? Yeah, possibly, and she argues away for it. But my question now is, if I put that back into this place, where the imagination is in situ, right? It's basically based in Europe, but that imagination is really from the outside. It's an outside gaze. How do we encapsulate that? So instead of the most photographed place, I would like you, if you want to have a chance to Google this, beautiful Europe, and I'm going to end soon. If you Google beautiful Europe, you would get the image, I would say within the first 4 images. You want to just try? Beautiful Europe. I'm going to end now. Sorry? Yeah. You get it? Number 2? Okay, good. Now, if you take beautiful Europe, you Google translate that, put it into Chinese. All right? Simplified. Okay? And you put it back onto Google Images and see what you get. You see anything? Beautiful Europe, you translate it into Chinese simplified and put it back onto Google Images. You should get something that looks
Chinese version of?
Yeah. This is what you should see. 欧洲美丽, it says. And you should see maybe this image. It should be number 3 or 4. No? Maybe? You should see this. Anyway, you don't see it? It doesn't matter. If you don't, you can play around with this, play with the different combinations. But what I want to end this with is what it says in Chinese then. It says in Chinese, 欧洲美丽风景的图片. And it means here, literally translated, that this is Europe's beautiful scenery, and 图片, 图 means art. 片 means a kind of slice, a strip, a plate, a sheet. And so when I read this, it again struck me, and this was last night actually when I was preparing this presentation, it struck me because really when you take this into perspective, the Chinese translation is a direct picturesque. It's going back to the tranche de terre. This is the slice of the landscape which they have managed to see with the black mirror. And so I would like to end by saying right now this presentation is no longer the most photographed village, but I would like to use the most beautiful village in Europe. And of course we can talk about it a small bit later. Thank you very much. Yeah.